Well, good morning, everybody. That was Ashley Hamel. I'm really grateful for her. She is a student at Princeton Theological Seminary, a candidate for ordained ministry, and is one of, as Stan mentioned, I'm the pastor for Union, a new church start here in the North Texas Conference. She is one of, we're about 5 years old, 5.5 years old, and she is one of 8 candidates for ordained ministry through Union. And we're really proud of her. I'm really grateful for Stan's introduction. I'm thrilled to have the chance to hang out with y'all today as we explore together a little bit about millennial generation, hearing from some members of that generation and seeing how it might inform our work together as we progress forward. A couple of things that I wanted to put out there. First of all, I would love to invite all of you to come to Union Coffee and enjoy some great coffee while you're here in the city of Dallas, but I can't because we are currently between locations. And I say that not in the way that like your son is between girlfriends or someone else is between jobs, and that we actually have a place lined up, and we're remodeling it and are eager to be able to move into that space and would welcome you to come back to Dallas and enjoy it in the future. In the meantime, our community continues to meet and grow. Some things about the community and why this group of folks are here. The vast majority of the people in our congregation are in their 20s, about a third of whom identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. It's worth a caveat also of noting that I am not a millennial, as all of these panels will be quick to point out to you. I just celebrated my 40th birthday about a week ago, so I can't claim to be in that category, but I've spent about 20 years of my life in ministry with them. Whether it's in children's or youth or what we sometimes call young adult or young professional ministry, I've had the chance to walk with them in faith. I've been inspired by them. I've been motivated by them, and I think they are in many ways the best of us as a church. So a couple things that I wanted to share with you to set the stage for the conversation. So first of all, and if we can have the slides up on the screen. So this is what we're talking about. Let's go to the first slide. I want to point out to you that there's no such thing as a millennial. Okay? So as we begin this panel of conversation about millennials and questions of LGBTQ inclusion in the church, I want to say that there is no such thing as a millennial. Now, obviously, there were people born between 1980 and 2001. In fact, a lot of them were born during that time. But the reason why I say there's no such thing as a millennial is that it's important to own in the midst of conversations around generations that these are broad, sweeping statements and generalizations. That it's still made up of a lot of individuals, some of whom will fit some molds and most of whom will not fit all the molds. In fact, one of the things that I've learned from folks in the congregation that I serve is that they kind of get annoyed sometimes when they're labeled as millennials. They may feel that way on the panel right now. In fact, we did like this little kind of congregational survey thing not that long ago and had people check boxes of what they kind of identified as. And one of them was identify as a millennial, and the other was, well, I guess I'm a millennial, but I hate it when people call me that. And we got like as many checking that as we had checking the millennial box. And the reason why it's important to own this reality before we get into the conversation is to own the fact that you will hear things from the research I'm about to present, you will hear things from people on the stage, and many of you will be thinking like, oh, I know a millennial, and that's not what she thinks. And yes, you probably do. But the reality is that we're talking about a broad range of people. And it's important to hold that before we move forward. I want to say also that what you'll hear from the folks on this panel, they won't all agree with each other. They see things differently. They've had different experiences. And the goal isn't to get them to agree on this is what millennials think. That's not the goal of this panel. They're not going to have a debate with each other. This is about presenting to you ideas and things that are important to a generation that we feel called to serve, and that we feel called to be in ministry with. I think it's very important that we pay attention to this generation, and it's important to have conversations like this for a couple key reasons. One is they are the largest generation period that America has ever seen, period. They outnumber the baby boomers significantly. which in some ways makes this whole conversation kind of a moot point, because time is on their side, friends. Ultimately, they will be the ones who make decisions about the future of the church, especially those who are going to be a part of it, whatever the church might end up being. So I think it's important to pay attention to them because they are the largest generation America has ever seen. Another thing that's important is that they are wildly underrepresented in the church and also by delegates to General Conference. They're wildly underrepresented based on their population size in the United States and around the world. And that's something that we need to consider and take to heart. And this is especially important when we consider the fact that at the beginning, the foundation of the church in Acts 2, right, Peter lines up the very first offices of the church are not to the well-established, it's not to the donor, it's not to those in charge, it's the young will prophesy, and the young will have visions. From the very beginning, the church has dedicated the role of prophets and visionaries to the young. We need to listen to them as we're making decisions about who we are. I think it's also important to listen to them because we just haven't been. Now, first of all, before we get to some data that I'm going to share, and then we'll get into conversation, I want to point out one other thing, that as we're talking about the data, I do not mean to suggest, and I want to be clear about this, I do not mean to suggest that the perceptions of a culture should dominate or dictate our theology and practice as a church. But whether you take a traditional or progressive understanding of Scripture, whether you're a compatibilist or non-compatibilist, whatever way you see moving forward, we have to take into account the realities of the people that we want to be in ministry with. I'm not saying that the generation should dictate our theology, but we need to be aware of it if we are going to engage with them. So let's look at the next slide and go into some of the data of what we've learned. This is from the Pew Research Center. And what we see regarding this question of millennials and their acceptance or support of same-sex marriage is that in 2003, they were the first generation in America to, by a majority, support same-sex marriage. But what we've seen is since 2003, that has grown in leaps and bounds. So that in 2017, 74% of millennials were supportive of same-gender weddings. That's significant, friends. Because that says not only has this generation, by and large, made up their mind around these questions, but that they are growing in their conviction of it. That's something that we need to be aware of and attentive to. And here's how I know that this data is real, not just because it comes from an organization like Pew Research, but also because if you might have noticed in June, it was Pride Month, how many businesses did you see turn their logos to flags of multiple colors? Hey there. Right? Like this was something that we saw consistently across the board. One of the biggest advocates for, say, like bathroom equality for transgender individuals, things like that, have been large corporations. Why? Because they've done their homework. They know that they need to be in relationship with a generation that is growing up, and they know how convicted that generation is about this. Their dollars are starting to matter more than the dollars of most of our church members. And so businesses are shifting their practices. They might not have been first on the forefront, but they are certainly advancing things now. Which again, isn't to say an argument for the church and how we function necessarily, but it is to say this data is real. And it is shaping our society. And it isn't just millennials. If we go to the next slide, you can see, so this is U.S. adults who favor or oppose same-sex marriage. The green are those who favor, and you see the shift that's happening. Every generation is increasing in their favor and support of same-sex marriage. This is a consistent trend. We need to be aware of it. So, let's engage in some conversation. Good, we've got at least one microphone up here. We've got a panel of 4 folks who all come to this from some different experiences, different perspectives, and different walks of life. They're all a part of the Union community here in Dallas. And I want to kind of do a thing where I'm going to ask each of them some questions that are more particular to their stories. And then I want to note that you can email me. It got a little cut off on the bottom there. But if you email mike@uniondallas.org, I would love to take your questions and bring them to the panel. So I've got this with me so I can check those things. Email whatever questions you might have, if it's for particular panelists or just in general, and we'll make sure to work that in. So I wanted to start first by talking to Angela. Hey, Angela. So we'll pass the microphone down that way. I'm going to pull this table over so it's out of the way. So I'm wondering, Angela, if you could just start by briefly describing your relationship with the church growing up and where you grew up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela. I did not have a relationship with the church at all. Very briefly, I went to choir practice at a church, but it was just to sing. And I would sing, and then I would leave after we were done singing. So my relationship with the church is new. It started probably a little over a year ago, and I'm really happy that I joined.
So could you say something about why you chose to be baptized and join the church just over a year ago?
Right. So when Mike we had a conversation, and Mike was the one who brought up, hey, do you want to be baptized? Easter's coming up. It'd probably really be a really good time. And I turned to him and I said, I don't think so. I don't think this is right. I don't have any signs. I I cuss a lot. And I was like, what do I wear? What am I supposed to do? And I thought about it for a little bit, and then I started crying. And then I realized maybe I don't know why, but I felt it that I probably should. And so I made the decision because I started crying.
Yeah. We'll take it. There's truth in tears. And Angela, leading up to that, was actually involved in helping to plan and execute one of the worship gatherings that we have at Union. I'm curious then, as someone who's relatively new to church, didn't grow up attending church or things like that, can you talk some about your experience or your perspective around the debates happening throughout the United Methodist Church around whether same-gender weddings or LGBTQ clergy or things along those lines?
Right. So I, as a self-proclaimed outsider to the church, I was confused by it. I didn't know that it was still going on. I thought it was already decided, to be honest. I thought people had moved on from same-sex marriage issues. I'm an ally, and I think that by now it shouldn't be a question.
Yeah. And what are some of the ways that you find yourself living out that role as an ally?
I try to speak out when it's needed, but I try to step back when there's LGBT individuals who can speak for themselves.
Cool. Thanks. We'll come back, Angela. I want to talk to Lauren for a second. This is Lauren over here. Lauren, could you briefly describe what your relationship was with the church growing up?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lauren. Growing up, I grew up Catholic, and it was a little bit more conservative. And as I got older, I found myself realizing that I had some tension in my body whenever I would go to church, and realizing that something didn't feel quite right. When I came out to my family, that's when I realized that one of the big pieces was that I wasn't fitting in to that church's doctrine. So actually, Carissa, somebody from Union, emailed me when we were in college and said, hey, we want to start this new church thing. Come on in, we'd love to hear your ideas. And I definitely came into Union with all of the rage that a person condemned to hell would come into that space. I was really excited to give everybody a piece of my mind. And then I realized that I was there and they were going to love me not in spite of who I was, but because of who I was as a full individual.
So you've been incredibly active in Union over time. You helped us launch a new worship gathering, and in the midst of launching that worship gathering, dedicated at least 4 hours a week for about 2 years to launching and then executing a worshiping congregation. You started an organization called Flow through Union, which is a group that works for gender equity in the city of Dallas. Honestly, it's kind of like what UMW can and should look like in 2018, and if anyone wants to know more about that, talk to Lauren because she's amazing. You showed at opportunities to talk to General Conference delegates, and you out-Methodisted several of them. I observed it. It was impressive. You worked for a United Methodist Church, but you never joined Union. Even though clearly Union was a place that was welcoming and affirming and everything else. Can you share some about why?
I read the Book of Discipline. There was a word, incompatible, saying that I was incompatible with the whole body, that church's teaching, and I couldn't sign my name on that line. I wouldn't do that.
Yeah. When we talked this past weekend, Lauren and I got together, and I did the whole like sugar packets thing. I didn't actually use sugar packets, so you don't know what I'm talking about there. But the whole kind of like progressive or traditional interpretation, compatibilist, non-compatibilist, and something kind of interesting came up in the midst of that. Where do you fit in those 4 categories, Lauren?
I don't think I fit in any of them.
Could you say some more as to why?
Yeah, absolutely. When I read the Bible and I read those passages that are so many people look at and say, this is the reason why we are not going to hold same-sex marriages in the church, that's how I take it. I believe if I sat down with Paul today, Paul would say, I'm not down for that. But I think the Bible's wrong. And so I find myself with those passages in this weird space, especially with the 4 corners that you described, trying to find a space that I belong with those designations.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that highlighted for me is something that I think honestly we're oftentimes unaware of in the church, which is like, and this is a growing edge for me leading stuff at Union, and Stephen was actually a really good voice as a part of our worship planning team in pushing me on this, is that like so much of our conversation around same gender relationships and LGBTQI questions and things of that nature at Union initially focused around like, okay, well these are the different interpretations of the scriptures that give us heartburn around this, and there's this way of looking at it, and there's this way of looking at it. And then there are times that folks like Stephen and some other members of the team would just say like, can we just say the Bible's wrong? And one of the things that's been interesting is I think there is this sense among a lot of millennials that just because the Bible says something doesn't mean it has any authority whatsoever. And we tend to operate in this world that is the only way we can derive authority, is through the scriptures. And so there are some real like tensions and interesting conversation points that have come up in the midst of that. And so we've shifted a lot of our conversations at Union around scriptures and how it is that we're faithful to them. And one of the things that I heard in Lauren's story at various times has been the kind of like, and just now, is this sense of acceptance but not really. And so we've talked more and more around Union, around the story of the Judaizers. Right, there's the questions around circumcision, where the Bible is really clear to be a part of God's children and God's family, you have to be circumcised. But at the Council of Jerusalem, they said, yeah, the Bible says that, but that no longer holds. Because Barnabas and Paul saw that God was at work in people who weren't circumcised to a greater degree than those who were circumcised in some cases. And Peter had visions of the church being opened up, and they had a big old meeting to decide how they would move forward. Does this sound familiar, church? And so what we've kind of come to as a community is this understanding that faithfulness to the Bible might be being faithful to that apostolic witness. It's another way of talking about things. Stephen, I invoked your name, so I want to turn to you now for a second. Could you talk briefly about your relationship with the church growing up and what that looked like?
Sure. I grew up in Houston, South Houston, going to a small Methodist church. I've never been outside the church. I went to SMU down the road for college and law school. Have been attending Highland Park since my first week of college. Started worshiping in Union. How old are we now? 5, 6 years old?
Yeah.
I've always faithfully attended, and there was never a time where I didn't feel welcome. And I'm a straight white guy, so it's pretty easy to feel welcome there. And so I've always attended, and it was never a place that I didn't feel like was my home. And that's kind of my experience with the church.
Yeah. And you've been a really active part of Union. You served as our board chair for several years. And I think it's fair to say that there are definitely times that you have a more traditional approach or theological perspective than some other members of the community who sit in a kind of either more progressive or way more progressive. And so can you talk some about what your journey has been like as you've gotten to know more people through Union, maybe who identify on the spectrum, or just kind of talk about what that journey's been like for you.
Sure. I think I'm going to back up just a little bit and add just a little more context. In college at SMU, I worshiped at Highland Park, but also participated in RUF, which is the Presbyterian College Ministry. And so I definitely had a very conservative, traditional view on the Bible. And I think it was actually during law school, I was sitting in the sanctuary at Highland Park, and all of a sudden, it just had nothing to do with the sermon. This question popped in my head: what about the dinosaurs? For like 6 months, I would go to worship, and I was like, what about those damn dinosaurs? Because I had been raised in this world where the Bible was the end-all, be-all, everything it says is true. There is no margin for error. There's no room to question. And I started going down this path of deconstruction where if I take away this one part, does it get rid of everything else? And that was uncomfortable. And it took a long time of working through that. But that's what kind of started my journey. And so one day I went over to Union, and one of the founding pastors there, along with Mike, just said, hey, they need warm bodies. Go and show up. And so I did. And after worship, they would go to a local bar, and they'd talk, and I went and would get in arguments with people. It's like, whoa, y'all are crazy. That's not what the Bible says. And they invited me in to be part of their worship planning team, and so we would have these conversations, and I'd be kind of a counterbalance.
Some people on the team used other words, but I like counterbalance. That's good.
But what it really came down to is I finally reached the point where I was okay saying, this is what I believe, but I might be wrong. And until I reached that point, I don't think I was really able to listen to the experiences of everyone else around the room. And so I got to this point. I was like, I believe this, but maybe I'm wrong. And everybody here, everyone who was around this worship planning table that I sat at for 18 months, had these experiences that didn't match up with what I knew the Bible to say. And I had to start trying to figure out a way to reconcile. I could see the humanity in them, I could see the godliness in them, the way they live their lives, and but that doesn't match up with what I know over here. And it's kind of funny that chart that Mike showed a while back about the way that millennials have adopted and been okay with gay marriage and homosexuality. When I joined Union, I was still firmly in the camp of homosexuality as a sin, but I want to be here anyways. And then eventually it got to the point of, I still think that's what the Bible says, but also you're awesome and you don't seem real sinful, so what do I do with this? And I sat there for a long time where I didn't know. And I was kind of like, okay, I don't know, and that's fine. And then eventually I kind of moved into where I am now. But it was the fact that I was able to sit with these people and that they were willing to allow me to sit with them even though we didn't agree, that slowly kind of chipped away at this idea that I had to be right, that what I thought was true for my entire life and before was it. And so simply being in the space with those people kind of softened my heart on that issue, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I was wrong, and now I believe this new thing, and heck, I might still be wrong, but I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Before we transition over to Sinclair and ask Sinclair some questions, I want to add in a story of someone who couldn't be here today, but we really wanted to have on the panel. The person's a member of our board at Union. She has been integrally involved in Union across so many steps of it, and has never gotten involved in Union as a religious community. That's just not, it's not her drive. That's not where her heart is right now. It's not where she ever imagines her heart being. But as a member of our board, she's been involved in conversations like, should Union become a reconciling church and things like that. And she did want at least some of her story to be told, and sends the regrets that she can't be here. But part of her perspective as an outsider to the church, and I think that's something that we don't hear from nearly often enough, right? Bishop Palmer talked about how we're doing the work for stakeholders who don't know they're stakeholders, right? Like, we have to listen to people outside the church. That's part of why we would take someone like Angela, who didn't know what she believed about the church at all, was unsure about this whole God thing, and put her on a worship planning team. Right? Because then we might actually put together a worship gathering that people who don't go to church might want to go to. And so it's important to listen to these voices, and the take of this board member, as we were discussing some things around becoming a reconciling church, and I just put this out there for a knowledge of how some millennials perceive this. She comes from a multiracial family. Her father's black, her mother's white, and she hears these conversations, and her simple response is, I don't understand how this is still a thing. People were arguing about whether or not the love that my parents shared before I was born was legal then. This feels like the same thing. It was an open shut thing for her, and it's just worth at least acknowledging that story is out there too. So Sinclair, I want to turn to you with a couple of questions. So Sinclair is also an amazing part of the team who designed Studio, our Sunday night worshiping community, worked alongside Lauren in that. Sinclair's an amazing singer, good Lord. Actually, 3 folks on the panel are amazing singers. Sorry, Stephen. The other 3 are incredible. Stephen can sing harmonies, not bad. But Sinclair's been a paid soloist at Methodist churches in the past. Can you share some about kind of what your relationship with the church looks like right now as you're starting some exciting things?
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Sinclair. My relationship with the church now is I've just started working for Union as a worship community curator for Studio. That's surprising to me. And I also have discerned thus far that I do feel that I have a call to ordained ministry, which is also a surprise to me.
What was, if you don't mind sharing, what was your relationship with the church like as a teenager?
Okay, so I grew up in a really conservative house. It's Texas, it's the Bible Belt. And in high school and beyond, I began to realize, like, oh, I am different. And I'm queer, and this is something that, although I have grown up with the church and I love it, is going to kick me out of it. And so I was like, I don't want to lose this, and so I went to gay camp, I did all of the things, I tried all of the things.
Can you explain gay camp for a second? Because some people might think
yes, it's
things.
not like fun. It's not fun, gay camp. It's not fun. It's like be less gay when you return. So I did all of that, and yeah, that's how I grew up for teenager time.
you used to sit in a similar position as Lauren did, as someone who is, really committed to the church, really involved in the church, but weren't willing to join, to sign on that bottom line. And now you find yourself, surprisingly to you, not to those around you who know and see your gifts and talents and graces and calling, but you find yourself in that weird place of like, gosh, I feel called to ordination in the Methodist Church, which has membership as a part of it. Can you talk some about the tension there or what changed?
Yeah, so I think my change in perspective comes from my intersection of identities. I'm not only a queer person, I am a Black person. So with that, I have the history of all of my family and all of my ancestors refusing to be denied rights that they deserve. I'm not doing it. I'm not. I'm not allowing my God or a church that I feel passionately about to be hijacked from me.
Thanks, Sinclair. Shut up, I'm not crying. Would welcome questions that you have for the panel. Feel free to email them to mike@uniondallas.org. I wanted to start with one of the questions that came in here, and it's dearest friends. He calls all of you friends. One of the most, and it comes from Jared Johnston, who is sitting over there and was a church planting resident at Union for a year. And he said one of the most powerful things about Union for me in my beautiful, colorful time there was Holy Communion, offered twice per week at the close of every worship service. And so he's asking, can you say why it's so important for a Union community to have the open table? Anyone?
I can start. Okay. With my Catholic upbringing, there was certainly expectations that were made to be met before you were able to take communion. Was another thing that didn't quite sit right with me. If this is something we saw God in, why didn't everybody have a piece of it? But then there was that space whenever I was receiving communion that everything just felt right in my soul. And it is so exciting to be able to offer that to everybody who comes to Union. I see it in their faces when they realize I'm accepted here. And this offering shows that. It's the best.
I'll piggyback off of the acceptance piece. Coming from someone who never took communion before, I honestly thought it was blood, not grape juice. And then I was like, maybe it's wine. Maybe I should go up there. But when I finally got the courage to get up there and actually take communion, I was like, oh, it's just bread and grape juice, and I'm allowed to take communion. That was the big piece, is that I'm allowed to. Everyone's allowed to. That was even bigger of a realization. And then when I was allowed to serve it, first of all, I was super nervous because I was like, what do you say? What do you say? I had to practice with someone. But I wasn't a member yet when I first started serving, and that was a big deal to me too, because again, it was this idea that everyone is allowed to do this.
That's one of the pieces that strikes me in that is just this kind of thing that, like, we assume certain practices make sense to people who haven't been a part of the church, like, but practicing communion, like, that's real and that's honest because it wasn't something that you had given to others before. It reminds me about a month or two ago, Union officially became a reconciling congregation, and there was a potluck for different reconciling churches in the area, which is one of the most churchy things that Union has ever done at that point. It was just kind of funny in the social media site where a lot of members of our community communicate with each other. One of them posted on the day of the potluck this thing of, this is what I did at lunch today, researched what is a potluck and how to contribute to it. And there was like a link on there of, so you want to go to a potluck, right? Like it's... As a follow-up question, Angela, I kind of want to ask one off of that, related to baptism. When you were baptized, can you talk about how much water was used?
Literally?
Literally.
A lot. There was a point where I was like, oh, he's still going. Like, I was like, can you hold on 1 second? I need to take a breath because it was a lot of water. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, the reason why I wanted to draw that out is that was a part of the conversation that we had. Angela made reference to this kind of question about like the practicalities, like what would it actually look like? And one of the things that I remember, I don't know if you remember, so I'm like priming you for something, and if it doesn't work, I'll just say it. But one of the things that I remember in that conversation was you asked how much water, and I said a lot, because I want every part of you to be covered by grace and this acceptance. And I think that that's something that I hear a lot from the millennials that I work with, is this notion that they are not interested in a church, they're not interested in a community, they're not interested in a job, they're not interested in anything where they can only be part of who they are in this place. They're really only interested in being a part of a community or a place or a job or whatever if they can literally be their full self. They're tired of fractured identities that they saw tear their parents apart. Can y'all speak to that at all? Like put some skin on that?
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll just speak for myself clearly, I guess. Growing up and not being able to be your full self is psychologically damaging. Surprise. And so once you like reach a point where you're like, oh, this is a spot where I can do this, you become accustomed to it. You become spoiled, I guess, by being able to be yourself. And so I think it would be really hard to go back to getting back in the closet, I guess. No one's here for that.
If I can just add to that, something that we spoke about when we were together was that I keep seeing the church give the LGBT community inches. And I'm really sick of it. It's exhausting. The idea that came about, a while ago, the love the sinner, hate the sin. For me, when you are speaking about that, about my identity and about that piece of my sexuality, it is so humiliating to hear. To find a space where I didn't have to feel that was so healing, and I second that it felt like I was being spoiled. And I also kind of think that's a ridiculous thing. That should be whenever I walk into any church.
I have a question here that I think is a good follow-up to that, and others might be able to tack on, or Lauren, if you have thoughts. He says this: it sounds to me that conservative position says that LGBT are welcome at table and membership, but just not ordination or marriage in the church. What would you say to help us understand what that position sounds like to you as a marginalized member of the community? Sinclair's ready.
So, since I'm wanting to get ordained, I'm reading the little book, what is it called?
The Christian as Minister.
The Christian as a Minister.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm looking through that, and I'm like, okay, cool. And I see in there for like deacons and people like that one of the things that they are called to is to lift up other people, to fight injustice, and to fight anything that takes away human dignity. And for you to tell me, you have no right. You have no right. So, yeah.
There's a preacher in Sinclair. And actually, there's a follow-up question for you, Sinclair. that actually is pretty related, so I'm not sure, you might have already addressed it. But how do you feel about the language in the book of discipline? I think you just spoke to that. How do you combat those words in your ministry, and how can you minister to others of God's inclusive love?
Okay. As far as like incompatible and all of those things, I ignore them. I do basically mental sit-ins. That's what I'm viewing my trying to get ordained as. It's not right. And also, I want to do it because I'm not the only person like this, right? So someone has to pave the way, and I'll do it.
I have a question for Lauren here. Do you see a day when you will or can feel comfortable joining a church, UMC or otherwise?
I think I'm holding out for the UMC. It's my church home, and it's a place that I was able to create in, and that I see God in. But not until the whole church, that whole body, can accept me, would I sign on that dotted line. And that doesn't mean a piece of it or some churches. It means when I see that the whole church is offering me the dignity I know I deserve.
I have a follow-up. Oh, they are running in. I have a follow-up question for Sinclair. First of all, so thankful for your representation that LGBTQ plus voices are here in the room and not just allies. Second, as an individual who feels strongly affirmed, called to ordain ministry in the United Methodist Church, what will you do if the church does not support the one church plan? Will you stay and fight? And for the record, the person who sends this question is in the same position. Plans on staying and fight, but doesn't think that they should have to.
I'm with you. Whoever you are, I'm in. I'm not going anywhere. I think this is something worth fighting for. I think the Methodist Church has a history of fighting for good things. So let's do it again.
I'm going to ask another question because it's worth acknowledging that like 75% of, or roughly the numbers of millennials do support same-sex marriage, which means another 25% do not, right? And we actually have, despite what some might assume, a decent number of folks in our congregation at Union over time who have had that perspective, and that perspective has shifted. I think we heard some of that from Stephen. And then we also have several folks in the community for whom that hasn't really shifted, but they find ways to love and connect and support other members of the community. So I'm kind of curious from the panel, there's something that's kind of magical about that at Union, that we can take this stance that's very clearly supporting and affirming individuals who identify on the spectrum, and yet also create space for conversation and home for people who maybe disagree with that. How does that work? Because it happens, and as the pastor, I'm honestly not sure how it happens. Any feedback from folks on the panel?
I think it requires a great deal of intentionality. When I started attending Union, I was certainly a vocal minority, but there was space for me to have my beliefs and engage, and I think most importantly, I wasn't pushed out the door, which so often I think there's a tendency to kind of think, even I think this, that the more conservative folk are likely to do that, but it's just as likely on the other side. So many people with good hearts are very passionate, and when you're passionate, oftentimes you kind of demand that people come to where you are. And if they're not willing to join, then see you later. You need to get on board or get out. And for whatever reason, I think one big thing is, and for those who've never attended our worship services, come on out. But Mike does a lot of engagement with the audience. He has a topic, and then we will discuss as a room. And so you get voices from around the room where people can question and discuss. And one thing he very rarely does, much to my chagrin initially, was take a stance. I wanted, like, here's what the scripture says, go on and do it. And oftentimes it was more of, what do y'all think about this? How can we process this together? And it was the space where, specifically Mike would create this space where if someone said something, if someone else disagreed with it, there was room for them to have these questions without feeling judged or like they were less than for feeling differently. And it was very important that space was intentionally created.
Feedback or move on to another one? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick little add-on. I think the balance that Union strikes too is that when I first started coming to Union, I was still in like the like letting all of my crazy feelings out after feeling like an outsider. So, but while I was there were other people, like allies and stuff, that were there to like help me feel supported. Because I think if you're coming out of that initially, it can feel like it's personal if someone disagrees with you. And like now, fine, think what you want, but I think as long as you have, everyone's really respectful, intentionality stuff.
One of the things that's been coming in several of the questions and emails with just some feedback has been appreciation of one of the things that you said, Stephen, of like, I believe this, but I might be wrong, and how important that is to entering into conversation. And I think that's something that regardless of our perspective, we need to hold to some measure too. I think there's also another piece in this too that's worth identifying, which is that we've struggled with this over time at Union as well. One of the things that we've noticed as we're in this kind of transition time where we're using this phrase of finding ourselves in the middle of nowhere, and one of the things and we've had this energy dip as we've been in transition, and one of the things that we attribute that energy dip to is not just the fact that we're in transition, but also we've had this realization that we've become a little echo chambery. And we have fewer conservative voices that are still conservative or that have a place there. And so one of the things that we're trying to do very intentionally among leadership is figure out how do we restore that? Because a lot of the life and a lot of the energy and the power of our Union congregation has been largely that diversity of opinions and voices. And so I just want to take a moment. Sometimes people stand on stage and everything sounds perfect and wonderful, and I just want to stand here for a moment and say it's really freaking hard, and we waffle back and forth in how well we do this. Okay, so I'm gonna hone in on one question and then wrap us up. So it's said that quote, hope is a song in a weary throat. And I think it's a good thing for us to ask the panel on how do you maintain hope on a day-to-day basis with so much strife in the church and in our nation as well? So how do you all maintain hope?
Man, God, I feel like that requires some processing. One of the things that Mike has preached on a lot, I think, is this idea of change. That change is natural, it's part of creation, it's part of who we are. There's this constant evolution. When you look at the history of civil rights movements in our country and how long they've taken, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And also, just full disclosure, it's really hard for me as the guy who goes to a church with a lot of LGBT folk to experience their pain or to understand it. I try, but it's never quite the same. And so it's honestly easier for me because I'm not suffering in the way they are. And I try to be with them, but there is a reality that it's never quite the same. But one of the things that I hold on to is this idea of, if we look at how long did it take for women's rights with voting to equal out and and black rights, and then we look at LGBT stuff, and it's getting shorter. Like, things change so rapidly now, and I think they're moving towards greater equality. And once again, it's easy for me to say this because I'm not the one who's being excluded, but I can see that these changes are happening faster and faster and faster, and I just have confidence, and I look back and see what this trajectory is, that we're moving towards this point where people are looked at with their full humanity. And I kind of just have this belief that, like, we're going to get there sooner than later, and we'll get there a lot sooner than we expect to.
My hope or positive outlook waffles a lot. But when I hear people like Sinclair coming up in the church and the power behind their voice, that gives me so much hope, and it's renewing. So,
I get hope because of the generations that keep following us. I'm a teacher, and I get to hear from high school students, 17 and 18-year-olds. Sometimes they say really smart things, and sometimes they don't. But I teach government economics, so we're constantly talking about really hard, tough issues. And there's some issues that I bring up, and I'm like, yeah, this is going to be a fiery discussion. And they're like, no, we all agree on this. And to be at a place where they all believe that a person who's LGBT is a person, and that's not a question, or same-sex marriage isn't even a question on the table for them anymore, that gives me hope.
I find a lot of hope in community. We have to, no one can be hopeful all the time, right? Especially like it can't be done. Like, people get tired, but that's why we have each other. And I think if we do keep in mind, like, lots of the things that the Methodist Church has, like, in the baptismal vows about, like, seeking justice and resisting evil, we have the freedom to do that. And that's a blessing.
I had said I wasn't going to read any more of the emails, but another one just came in, and I need to read this one. It says, as Sinclair's mother...
Oh, my God.
The calling on his life to be an ordained minister is no surprise to me. I celebrate who God created him to be, a voice not only to the community, but to the world for civil rights for all. I want to wrap with, to close things up with just some final thoughts on this and what I've learned from this community and from others who work with millennials. And that is that we know from the studies with the rise of the nuns and the non-religiously affiliated that discontent with the church among emerging generations has never been higher, at least for as long as we can remember. But there's also a gift in discontent. Because when people feel like they don't have a home in systems and organizations as they are, out of that comes entrepreneurship. Because people will long for a home, will push for a home, and if they can't find it in things as they are, they will create a place that looks like home. This is how God has maintained God's work over time. Shannon Ross, who works for the Lilly Foundation, talks about millennials and says, like, millennials are witnesses to just how much God loves us. Because when God loved the Israelites and they wandered away from being God's people and following God's message, God would appoint a prophet to course correct. Well, God has appointed a whole generation in Shannon Ross's perspective. We stand at an opportunity where discontent with the church is at its highest, which means that there are going to be more entrepreneurs than we've known for a long time. And we in the church have a choice. Will we walk with them? Will we treat them as the prophets and visionaries that Peter says that they are? Or will they start their own thing? God's going to use them either way. We have an opportunity, traditional or progressive, to decide if we're going to walk with them, if we can make room for all. I want to thank y'all. I want to thank this panel. They are amazing.